Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Waterford United. Today with Pete Davis, candidate for Waterford First Selectman. Also today we're going to be talking I've been looking forward to this show, to tell you the truth, Pete, because we're going to be talking some about Waterford history and some family history of both Pete Davis and candidate for Board of Selectmen Glenn Patterson. And Harry Truman famously said about the presidency that the buck stops here. But the truth is that the buck stops with you, the voters, because that's the decision that truly matters, that we get the government that we deserve, and we get the best government, I think, by consciously and thoughtfully choosing the candidates that we decide to vote for. And part of good government comes from the character of the candidates. So that's why I've been looking forward to this show, because I've known Pete Davis and I've known Glenn Patterson for a long time, and I know the depth and quality of their character. And it comes from a lot of things in their own lives and also from their family background. Another kind of famous saying most of you will know is, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Well, the family tree, in this case, of both First Selectman candidate Pete Davis and Board of Selectmen candidate Glenn Patterson, is a very healthy tree with a lot of Waterford roots in it. So that's one of the reasons I've been looking forward to this show. I love the fact that so much of Waterford's history is contained in the families that have helped make Waterford propel forward for so many generations now. And Pete, in your case, that family tree and that family history, not only deep, but very broad. Your dad was First Selectman. Your grandfather had an important, very important role in the early years of the fire service and in Waterford. And I guess I'd like to talk about that a little bit, and if you don't mind, maybe you could help the voters understand a little bit about your family history.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. This is a welcome break because I know the content of most of the shows has been about town government and policy and some of the issues that the town has been facing.
That's right.
So I think this is a good opportunity to have the voters become a little bit more familiar with myself as a person. And I have to say, Glenn is actually helping his daughter with a vehicle problem this morning, so he's not able to join us. But we will talk a little bit about Glenn's background also.
Great, that would be good.
First of all, Paul, I am so glad you're back. As our viewers know, Paul's been wrestling with some health issues recently. I'm glad he's back. Two reasons: because his health is improving. The second reason, quite honestly, is being a talk show host is not at the top of my list of things I want to do. So we made a valiant attempt last month in your absence, and I'm very glad to see you back in the seat.
It's good to be back with you, Pete. Yeah. And it's good to be feeling better, too, as you know, because you visited me many times. It was a long road, but we're getting there.
Yeah. Paul, a lot of people will tell you that maybe the public service thing is hereditary. I think in my case it probably is to some extent.
Yeah, I think you're right.
As you mentioned, going back to my grandfather, they moved here in the early 1900s. The homestead was up on the corner of Clark Lane, where the convenience store and the gas station is now. And they owned the corner where Spithead Road is, actually all the way down to the brook down by Dunkin' Donuts, actually.
Yeah.
And they ran greenhouses in a summer place where you could get hot dogs and hamburgers. My dad's job as an early kid was giving pony rides. So I was very fortunate that they settled here in Waterford. The other thing that I'm very happy about is my grandfather became very involved right off the bat in the community. He was one of the original incorporators of Jordan Firehouse back in 1928, I think that was.
I think that's really a significant factor in itself. It shows, because so much of Waterford's history is contained in the evolution and modern technology now that's come forward with the fire service. But the roots of the fire service, I think, have influenced the direction of the community for generations. And your grandfather was there at the beginning for Jordan Fire Company.
Yeah. Back in the early days of Waterford, there were basically two places where communities gathered. It was either the churches or the firehouses. Yeah. And I think probably the firehouses were probably more the community-based
Yeah.
places that kind of drove the agenda for the town in those early days.
Even when I was a child, it was like that. In Quaker Hill, it really felt and seemed and was like that. Yeah.
And that public service aspect within the family is continued. My dad was very active in Jordan Firehouse. A couple of my brothers were bunkmen at Jordan. My brother Dan was a paid man at Cohansey in town for years. My youngest son Josh actually had started the process at Jordan to become a full member, and he got a full-time job, so that kind of got set aside. So my son Josh would have been fourth generation involved in the fire service. So that whole public safety aspect within the community is a very important thing to our family, and it continues today. Just briefly, my experience in government, I actually got involved in my early 20s. I was appointed to the Conservation Commission by Larry Betancourt. I spent 7 years on the commission, 5 of those years as chairman.
I recall your work there.
Yeah, and that was really a good entry-level position, so to speak, to become educated in how government functioned. Mm-hmm. I had some idea because my dad had been so involved, but at that age, it's kind of, it's background conversation to some extent. So it was a good stepping stone, I think, for myself to become involved and learn government processes, and it was a good experience. Did a term on the RTM, Board of Finance, and of course I served with you on the Board of Selectmen for a term, and then left and went to Norwich, change of career essentially. But one of the things, it's interesting, one of the things I learned in Norwich, which is a much different environment obviously than Waterford, is that there's a common theme that runs through all communities, I think, and that's communities being built on neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. In Norwich, the neighborhoods evolved around the mills.
Yes.
In Waterford, it was basically the firehouses and churches. Mm-hmm. And it's so important to maintain the fabric of those neighborhoods even today, because that's what your community is really about. I've learned over the years in Norwich that even small things that you wouldn't think would be significant can have a significant impact on neighborhoods. I've also learned that a small group of people within a neighborhood can affect change.
Yes.
You may not always agree with the change, but they have a voice, and that's important. I don't know if you,
that goes back. Before we go to Glenn, a couple of questions I wanted to ask you, if you don't mind. It goes back to my opening comment that neighborhood connection, that neighborhood involvement in the community, I agree with you, is true in, I think, every municipality, large or small. But also, that underscores how important it is that people do get to the polls to vote and help in that decision-making process, because those decisions affect their families' daily lives.
Oh, absolutely.
And it may seem remote at some level. Town Hall may seem a long way away from some street in Quaker Hill, but the effect on your daily life is profound, and you have to participate, because the buck really stops there. Sure. With you, the citizen. Pete, I wanted to talk a little bit too because he was a role model to me in my early career, about your dad's service as Waterford First Selectman, because that was, I know he became not only a role model, but he demonstrated to me as a young person, a recent college graduate, how to behave in government. I mean, I guess I would put it that way, because he had such a I thought, an excellent way of interacting with the Board of Finance, the RTM, the public, the various constituencies. As you said, small groups can influence big decisions. Your dad had a way of listening that was very, very instructive to me, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that from your perspective.
It was interesting, because coming from a family that had been involved in community service and in the community for years and years, my dad was very quiet. It was a quiet influence.
Yeah, he was personal. I mean, his personality was that way. You're right.
Yeah, it was never, it was never really voiced. Mm-hmm. directly to us, you know, you need to be involved in the community, you have an obligation to your community. It was really, he led by example. So watching him through the years and the way he went about it, just very quiet, and he really, you know, he led by example, I guess is the best way I can put it. And it was interesting, as I became more involved, he was always a good sounding board, because he knew the community so well, and he just had a way of placing things in perspective, I guess is the way I would put it. Of course, young people, when they get involved, there's a lot of fire and brimstone going on.
Yes.
But he would kind of bring it down to the common denominator and actually, through just a conversation like we're having, bring it back to where it really had to be. So that was the kind of influence he had. And I think that same type of influence within the town, you know, I'd always heard a number of people tell me that if they had gone to my dad for something, maybe they didn't get the answer they wanted, but at least he would tell them why, explain why his position was perhaps opposite of what theirs was. So again, that just that type of very quiet leading by example. You know, I think, you know, when I look at the national scene, unfortunately,
the noise and
we could probably
fuss and feathers.
Use a little more of that these days. So you know, it was. I have to say, it was a good way of influencing me as a young person.
You know, Pete, I said when I was asking you about your dad's service as first selectman, he was a role model to me. As I said, I was a recent college graduate, and you know, full of some of that same fire you talk about, wanting to get things done yesterday. That seemed like, why didn't previous generations get this done, kind of thing. But your dad did have that perspective, and he carried that on even after his years of service as first selectman, because years later, when I was first selectman, you know, your dad and I would have several conversations. One was about, you know, the proper approach toward the civic triangle and the community's commitment to that over the decades and over various plans of development going back to the 40s. And your dad not only highlighted that history, but gave me some good advice about how best to proceed. And that was important. But also, I remember a very tragic day when the finance director, Art Davis, had an attack at work. He suffered a heart attack, and your dad happened to be there doing some research that he was doing on town history. And so he and I both went down to Lawrence Hospital, where Art unfortunately died. And while we were waiting in the little waiting room in the emergency room section of Lawrence Hospital, he and I were talking, and he just quietly said, it wasn't any panic or anything like that, but he quietly said that after we were told by the doctor that Art had passed away, he said, "This is a very important role, Paul. You're going to have to give this the right attention to make sure you get this covered right. This is something that you can't do without." And it wasn't an admonition. It was more just like good counsel, good, quiet, careful counsel. And I took it that way. I mean, Art was a member of your family, but he was still giving me good advice for how the town should best proceed. And that was, to me, very, very significant and symbolic of how your dad's service had been carried through.
Some people have heard me say this before, big shoes to fill.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting, the night we had our kickoff event at Philomena's in April, I had an older couple, probably in their maybe mid to late 60s, come up to me, and completely unsolicited. And they said they were there because they had moved to town some years ago, and that my dad had actually given them their first mortgage so they could buy a house. Now, I never knew he did that kind of thing. I don't know if my mom knew it either, but you know, that was nice to hear. But that was typical of my dad. He just always tried to help folks out when he could.
And you know, in those years, early years, I was working for the Waterford Recreation Department, and there were several times that your dad gave me some advice about my work there too, and it was quiet advice. Again, it wasn't any kind of, shaking his finger like, do it this way. It was more like quiet advice of how I would probably succeed better proceeding this way or that way.
It was one of the things I miss. I was in business, insurance agency, Davis Insurance Agency, with my dad and my mom for years.
Well, I was going to ask you about this part of your career, too.
Yeah. One of the things I miss is Saturday mornings. We always worked half a day. Well, we really pretended to work. We really didn't do much.
Yeah,
work.
it was Saturday gathering.
It was Saturday morning. So what would happen is we'd show up and we'd put on a pot of coffee, and it was usually 2 or 3 pots, because we knew sooner or later, people like Donnie Brigham were going to wander in, Joe Badalis,
Oh, yeah.
Woody Giordani.
I remember Mr. Badalis because he
Yeah.
was moderator of the RTM
Yep.
during your father's service.
So it was, that typical Rockwell kind of thing where, the hardware store around the wood stove, but it was in the insurance agency around
Yep.
the coffee pot.
Yep.
But just as a young person being able to listen to those conversations, and my dad always said, these are the most valuable things you have. It's not just for hanging a pair of glasses. But just to listen to those conversations, and there were also people in there. My dad was a Democrat pretty much forever, but Republican leadership and Republicans also.
Oh, yeah, I know that. I knew that even when he was first
Spike
selected.
Joyce was
Correct.
another one.
Yeah.
My dad would stop down to see Spike Joyce, and they'd walk in the back of Spike's office and have
Yeah.
conversations.
They came from 2 different parties, but they shared their commitment to Waterford.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And there was always that kind of cooperation and collaboration that went on. And, it always struck me that, that was a free education for me.
Yes.
And it was interesting to listen to different perspectives, but in the end, they might disagree on something, but they always remain friendly. And I think that's key in local government, especially
I do
in
too.
Waterford. Yeah.
I do too.
And I'm happy to say, for the most part, I think that still continues, that tradition.
Yes.
I think after elections are over, they're over.
Yep.
And people
Try
honestly
to work for the best interests as they see fit.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I agree. And, I remember your dad on his work with as first selectman with some of the Republican leadership, and it was instructive for me to watch. I tried to imitate that when I became first selectman and work with whoever it didn't matter to me, and it wasn't a question I even asked. I just wanted people who wanted the best interest for Waterford and weren't trying to pursue, some personal agenda or aggrandizement. But if their interest was the community, boy, they were a teammate for me. And your dad was like that.
One of the other legacies I think that my dad left, and he's instilled actually in myself and all my brothers, is just a respect for open space.
Yes.
And parklands. He was deeply involved in the purchase of Waterford Beach. He
Yes.
was involved in the Stanger Field
Yep.
issue. But we grew up and we were taught to respect nature and the natural environment. And I've carried that with me in Norwich. I've actually done a number of park projects in Norwich that have added significant open space land and trail lands to the inventory in Norwich. I served on the board of directors early in the infancy of the Quinnebog-Shetucket Heritage Corridor.
Yes.
Which basically it starts in Norwich and it goes up into the Quiet Corner.
Right.
They'll actually tell you that it starts in the Quiet Corner and terminates in Norwich, but I prefer to do it the other way.
No, that's a significant achievement.
Yeah.
Your dad was very supportive of that his whole life, and that was another thing when I was first selectman. My efforts in those areas, which I tried to make as significant as was humanly possible, your dad was very supportive of and helpful to me and instructed me different ways that would be best to try to proceed. Because you're right, that was a lifelong interest and commitment of his that, again, he tried to help others foster the best way forward that way too.
And that's just an issue of foresight.
Yes.
Looking to the future and realizing that some decisions you're going to make today are going to impact literally generations, literally centuries,
Correct.
Potentially.
Yeah.
And he always valued that and realized the benefit of that for communities.
You probably know, because late in his life he used to enjoy walking Stanger Field.
He did.
And it was that appreciation of nature which was just in his soul. I mean, that's how your dad, and that was the center part of Waterford, And he was so happy that it had been preserved the right way.
Yeah, you could either find him at Stanger's or Waterford Beach with actually a Dalmatian that my brother Dan
Oh,
had to
yes,
give up.
I recall both, yes.
Yeah, funny story behind that. Just quickly, my brother Dan used to have that dog at the firehouse.
Yes.
But the dog became so possessive of the fire truck that if the dog was in the truck, the guys couldn't get into the truck. So the dog got shipped to my parents' house.
So he had to become associated with your dad.
Yeah, he lived out a long and happy life with my dad.
He probably learned to be a little more quiet, too.
A little bit, yeah.
You know, Pete, we're kind of running out of time, but what we've talked about, and we want to talk about Glenn's background in Waterford some too, but I want to say first that everything we've said here, as homespun as it sounds, shows a hometown commitment in your family and in yourself that helps convince me that you are exactly the right person to be Waterford's next first selectman, because you have that understanding from your work in the insurance agency, from your work on the various boards and commissions you served on in Waterford, and from your family's long understanding of that importance of community commitment and community service and furthering the interest of the greater good of the community. It helps inform, in my view, how prepared you are to be our next first selectman. And I hope the voters understand that. That's why we talked about all this today. I mean, they're fun stories to talk about, but it has a deep, deep meaning for the future of the town, in my view. And in that vein, if you don't mind, maybe, because you've been friends with Glenn for so many years, maybe I could ask you to share a little bit about his Waterford biography.
Sure. Glenn's family has been in the town of Waterford for over 40 years. His parents, Bert and Naisha Patterson, live out right on the corner by Oswegatchie School.
Yes.
A lot of people know Bert because Bert, again, has been very involved in the community on a number of different levels. And he passed that on to Glenn. Glenn did a term on the RTM.
I recall that.
Yeah.
I was working for Waterford Recreation when he was on the RTM.
Yeah, very active in youth sports organizations. He's
Yes.
a literacy volunteer. So again, just that good grassroots.
I didn't know the literacy
base.
volunteer work too.
Yep.
Yeah.
Again, Glenn has done these things quietly, and he's got the same base that I do. He honors the commitment of community service and how important that is. Married, 2 daughters. I've kind of lost count. I think he's got 4 or 5 grandchildren.
Yeah, it might be
now.
5. I don't know. I'm trying to remember what he said, but yeah,
His daughter Erin just
had a baby.
But
Yeah.
Glenn spent his career over electric boat. We're both planners. His disciplines were a little bit different. He actually did project management and scheduling. So he's got a vast amount of experience, obviously, in very large contract and project management and facilitating and scheduling those projects, obviously, to deliver those on time and within budget. So he retired in May of this year, and then he went back to work as a consultant for a little while, but he's completely retired now. When I was trying to make the decision about having somebody take this journey with me, I needed somebody that I could trust, obviously, but I also wanted somebody that had, I think it's very important to have the experience, that planning and project management background, because I think that translates to municipal government very well.
In this campaign effort, I've witnessed what you're talking about, and Glenn has an uncanny ability, analytical ability, and fact-finding ability that I think helps. That helps to underscore, I think, his ability to help you when you're first selectman make the best, most practical, empirically based decisions for the community's steps forward. So he does have that. It's a really remarkable thing to witness.
I think it's really important for me to know and the community to know that this is a true partnership. I wanted somebody that was able to step up to the plate and help address some of the challenges ahead of us, but also to address some of the opportunities.
Yes.
And I think Glenn's that person. One of the things I value most about Glenn is that Glenn will push back. We started this conversation back in actually February and March of this year, and through the whole process, and you can attest to this, Paul, in our campaign meetings, Glenn is not afraid to speak his mind and speak up, and that's actually true of the entire campaign group.
Oh no, it's so true though, because I remember once when I have a good memory, and I you know, I have a lot of facts in my mind, but I was recounting what I viewed as the historical process that had taken place on a certain event. And Glenn readily said to me, without any meanness of spirit, but he just said, I think you're getting those facts mixed up a little bit. And then he had them right because he had researched it. He does have that. It's a wonderful, nice ability. It's not a tough ability, but it's a nice ability.
No, so I don't think, maybe my opinion's biased, but I don't think I could have picked a better running mate in this instance.
I think he's a great running mate.
And the fact of the matter is that you know, I think if the town is in Glenn's hands for some reason, I think the town is in very good hands.
I appreciate everything you're saying, and I agree with it because I've witnessed it firsthand from his volunteer work on the various youth sports programs to his service in the RTM, and most particularly in this campaign. I've learned why you chose him as a running mate. We're about out of time, but I do want to say one more thing about Glenn. When I said earlier that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, both of his daughters worked for me as they were teenagers down at Waterford Beach, and they were among the most responsible, self-reliant, you know, trustworthy young people I'd ever had work for me. I didn't have to question ever whether they were there on time or whether they were carrying out the duties that they had been instructed, because they did it I mean, if all the employees that I had, particularly the teenagers that I had working under my supervision, carried themselves with the same kind of maturity that those two girls did, you know, I could have taken long vacations. But they were great kids, and that shows the kind of family that Glenn has too.
No, we were lucky enough. Our kids were very close growing up, and yeah, it's been pretty much a lifelong relationship at this point. And yeah, again, I couldn't ask for a better person to be doing this with.
Pete, you know, with that, I've enjoyed this show because I enjoy talking about these issues. Your own family history I knew a lot about because I've known your dad and you, your mom, and your brothers for a long, long time, and I appreciate everything we talked about, and I'm glad we had a little chance to talk about Glenn's family too. And for you, the voters, I hope this will help you in making your decision, because Pete and Glenn are going to be doing door-to-door work and meeting a lot of you in person. And I hope you can realize, as I do, that these are two trustworthy, well-grounded, sensible people that have the ability to lead our town in the right direction going forward. So with that, we'll look forward to seeing you next time for Waterford United. And Pete Davis, I really enjoyed being with you this morning.
Thank you, Paul. This was actually a fun show.
It was. I enjoyed it too. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.